45 trees. That is the entire wild population of a species that survived 200 million years, longer than the Atlantic Ocean has existed, longer than the Rocky Mountains, longer than the first flowering plant, confined to a single canyon in New South Wales that the Australian government refuses to mark on any public map. In January of 2020, that canyon nearly burned. A 1.2 million acre wildfire drove smoke over the walls for 4 consecutive days, and for those 4 days, no one on Earth knew whether any of those 45 trees were still alive. The entire wild population of a 200 million year old lineage held in uncertainty inside 4 days of smoke. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how a species that spent 2 million years hiding inside a secret gorge in subtropical Australia is now reproducing more aggressively in the frost and rain of Sussex, England, than it ever did at home. And it will permanently change how you think about where a species actually belongs versus where we found it. Here is the detail that should not be possible. The Wollemi Pine does not merely survive in Britain. It seeds directly into British soil, in open ground, with no greenhouse, no supplemental heat, no managed light. In 2025, the trees at Wakehurst produced 168 cones. Laboratory testing confirmed 134 viable embryos. The scientists who have spent decades studying this species cannot fully explain the reproductive rate. Think about that. The Wollemi pine is not a pine. It belongs to the family Araucariaceae, one of the oldest surviving conifer lineages on Earth, with unbroken fossil evidence stretching back 200 million years to the Jurassic, when Gondwana was still a single landmass and the first dinosaurs were moving through wet, ancient forest. Those forests left fossil traces across every Australian state. Then the continent separated from Antarctica and drifted north. Over tens of millions of years, the interior dried. The Araucaria lineage retreated, contracted, and disappeared from the fossil record. By the early 20th century, botanical science had classified the genus Wollemia as extinct, its last confirmed fossil dated at approximately 2 million years old. It was not extinct, it was hiding. On approximately the 10th of September 1994, David Noble, a field officer with the New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Service, a man who had personally named more than 200 remote geographical features across the Blue Mountains region, rappelled into an uncharted gorge in the Wollemi wilderness on a recreational canyoning trip. Noble was not conducting a survey. He was not following a botanical lead. When he reached the canyon floor and looked up at the trees surrounding him, he recognized nothing. Bark like bubbling chocolate. Fronds he had no name for. He collected samples and carried them out. Back in Sydney, no taxonomist could identify the samples. The genus was eventually classified as entirely new to science, Wollemia nobilis, named after the wilderness and the man who found it. The location of the canyon was immediately classified. It remains so today. The coordinates are not publicly available. The access trail is not documented. The Australian Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water confirmed in its March 2025 National Recovery Plan that 45 mature individuals and 46 seedlings persist across 4 localities within a single canyon system. The Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, records that Wollemia nobilis holds the highest EDGE score, a combined measure of evolutionary distinctiveness and global extinction risk, of any gymnosperm on Earth. The conservation response was rational, careful, and methodical. Beginning in the late 1990s, cuttings were distributed to a small number of trusted botanical institutions globally. 2 specimens were established at Kew. A controlled population was developed at Wakehurst in West Sussex. The logic was sound. If the canyon burned, the species would not burn with it. A distributed insurance policy, genetically diverse, geographically dispersed, permanently beyond the reach of any single fire. And for years, the trees grew slowly, as expected, as managed, as contained. But in 2010, something at Wakehurst stopped following the model. And by the summer of 2025, the data coming out of Sussex had broken every conservative baseline the botanists had set. 45 trees. That is the entire wild population of a species that survived 200 million years, longer than the Atlantic Ocean has existed, longer than the Rocky Mountains, longer than the first flowering plant, confined to a single canyon in New South Wales that the Australian government refuses to mark on any public map. In January of 2020, that canyon nearly burned. A 1.2 million acre wildfire drove smoke over the canyon walls for 4 consecutive days, and for those 4 days, no one on Earth knew whether any of those 45 trees had survived. Not one botanist, not one government agency, not one conservation team with a decade of work invested in that single grove. The entire wild population of a 200 million year lineage, held in complete uncertainty inside 4 days of smoke. Now here is what you need to understand about what followed. The global response to that near-extinction event was not to rebuild the Australian population. It was to scatter the species across the world, to botanical gardens in France, Germany, New Zealand, South Africa, and most significantly, to the open ground of West Sussex, England, at 51 degrees north latitude, in soil that receives more annual frost events than the canyon where this tree spent its entire known existence. And the tree did not merely survive the transfer. It began to reproduce, not in a climate-controlled greenhouse, not under managed heat or supplemental light, in open British rain, seeding directly into British soil and producing viable embryos at a rate that has, as of 2025, left the scientists monitoring it without a clean explanation. That is the information gap at the center of this investigation. Not how a prehistoric tree survived a wildfire, but why a species that spent 2 million years hiding inside a subtropical Australian gorge is now, by every measurable metric, thriving more effectively in England than it ever did at home. Auditing an environmental mismatch of this scale requires stabilizing our geographic coordinate field. Enter your state, province, or territory in the comments below, and note specifically if your local woodlands are currently showing unexpected canopy loss or accelerating thermal stress. Interlocking with Earth Discovery Series right now locks your feed into unvarnished field metrics long before the commercial networks update their reporting. Now back to the Sandstone Gorge, because this tree's evolutionary blueprint was buried deep inside a sheer cliff network, and what was hidden there is far stranger than the survival story anyone published. The canyon where Wollemi pines still grow today was not a typical forest. It was an evolutionary hiding place. The walls of the gorge are Triassic sandstone, carved over hundreds of millions of years into a near-vertical enclosure more than 100 meters deep. Sunlight reaches the canyon floor only in filtered, diffuse light. The soil is shallow and hyper-acidic, a pH between 3 and 4, chemistry so hostile that almost nothing else can establish a root system there. Annual rainfall exceeds 1,000 millimeters. The microclimate inside those walls is cool and stable in ways the surrounding Australian plateau has not been for tens of millions of years. The canyon did not protect these trees by accident. It preserved the precise atmospheric conditions of Gondwana inside a sandstone envelope while the continent dried around it. That is a devastating thought, held quietly. The last wild members of a 200 million year lineage are alive today not because they were strong, but because one gorge happened to remember the world they were built for. And that vulnerability, every last individual confined to a single, unmapped point on the planet, is precisely what the Gospers Mountain fire of 2019 almost converted into a complete extinction event. Tracking a crisis of this depth requires an audience willing to follow the evidence all the way through. If that describes you, hit subscribe now. Because when the seed data from Wakehurst cleared the international vaults, the numbers did not confirm the models, they invalidated them entirely. Then in 2010, something nobody had formally anticipated occurred in the frost of southwest London. And by 2025, the reproductive data shattered every conservative baseline. The original transfer was modest by design, 2 specimens to the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, a small managed cohort at Wakehurst in West Sussex, 51 degrees north latitude, in ground that freezes. The institutional expectation was survival, Slow, managed, monitored survival, not reproduction, not natural seeding, survival. The trees began producing cones, in open air, without intervention. Then the 2025 mast year arrived, a biological event with no precedent in the recorded history of this species, and the numbers came back from the laboratory. 168 seeds collected, 134 confirmed viable embryos. Annual height growth logged between 30 centimeters and 1 full meter per year, in British soil, in British rain, with zero supplemental heat. Not surviving, thriving, accelerating. 170 genetically sequenced young trees have since been distributed across 28 botanical gardens throughout Europe. The insurance policy had become a propagation engine. 3 data points, 1 species, every single metric moving in the wrong direction for the catastrophe model and the right direction for something nobody had a name for yet. But the finding that reframed everything proved this was not a story of sudden adaptation. The tree had been living in a geographic lie for millions of years. But the finding that reframed everything proved this was not a story of sudden adaptation. The tree had been living in a geographic lie for millions of years. The assumption built into every conservation decision made about this species since 1994 was the same assumption built into every conservation framework on Earth. A species belongs where you found it. The canyon in New South Wales was its home. Britain was an experiment, Excel with good intentions. That assumption is wrong. In a peer-reviewed study published in Plants, People, Planet, researchers aggregated data from 1,510 cultivated Wollemi Pine specimens growing across multiple continents and climate zones. The dataset was not small. It was not anecdotal. 1,510 individual data points mapped against soil chemistry, temperature range, humidity, frost frequency, and annual precipitation. The physiological sweet spot that emerged from that analysis sits between 2 degrees C and 4 degrees C, with consistently high atmospheric humidity. That is not the climate of subtropical New South Wales. That is the climate of southern England. The Wollemi Pine was not hiding in that canyon because Australia was home. It was hiding there because that canyon was the last place on the continent that had not yet become something the tree could not survive. Not adapted, not resilient, stranded, for 2 million years, inside the one remaining pocket of a world that no longer existed anywhere else on the continent it was marooned on. This divergence between where a species was found and where it was actually built to live is now actively disrupting global restoration frameworks. If you are tracking assisted migration trials, introduced forestry plots, or unexpected growth anomalies in your region, document them in the comments below. That field data shapes the macro mapping. Now look closely at what the final deployment of this species actually looks like in practice, because the arithmetic that followed was brutally simple. The arithmetic made the final choice brutally simple. Localization is a death sentence. True survival requires building a distributed, borderless infrastructure. Species survives 200 million years. A single wildfire nearly ends it in 4 days. The place we called its home turns out to be a prison it could not escape. The place we called its exile turns out to be where it was always trying to get back to. 170 genetically sequenced individuals, now growing in 28 countries, producing cones in open ground, seeding into foreign soil without assistance, without instruction, without any model that predicted this would work. The question is no longer whether assisted migration can save endangered species. The question is how many species we have already condemned by insisting they belong only where we found them. If our existing conservation frameworks are trapping dying lineages inside static historical borders that actively clash with their evolutionary needs, the entire global rulebook is obsolete. Drop your analysis on assisted migration in the comments alongside your home coordinate, and if this investigation changed how you calculate climate and species data, secure your subscription to Daily Earth Discoveries. Because in our next case file, a private coalition in North Rhine-Westphalia released exactly 6 wild bison into a written-off commercial timber valley, and what those animals rebuilt in under 10 years makes everything in this investigation look like a warm-up. This tree did not survive the age of dinosaurs, 2 continental breakups, 2 million years of isolation, and 1 catastrophic wildfire by staying where it was told to stay.